Just hours before one of the most closely watched diplomatic meetings of the year, the Kremlin delivered a message that immediately cooled expectations for a breakthrough in Ukraine. Russian officials said they had seen nothing tangible regarding reports of a new peace proposal that Ukrainian and American officials were reportedly discussing ahead of President Donald Trump's meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Washington. That statement came from Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who dismissed reports of a possible air ceasefire proposal as little more than media speculation. Instead of signaling optimism, Moscow suggested there were no concrete details worthy of discussion. After more than 4 years of war, every hint of diplomacy captures worldwide attention. But every rejection also reminds the world how difficult any negotiated settlement remains. Tonight, we'll examine why the Kremlin responded this way, what is actually being proposed behind the scenes, why both Russia and Ukraine continue preparing for prolonged conflict despite renewed diplomatic contacts, and what this could mean for Vladimir Putin's political strategy in the months ahead. Since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, numerous diplomatic efforts have attempted to stop the fighting. Some negotiations collapsed almost immediately. Others produced temporary humanitarian agreements but failed to create lasting military ceasefires. As the conflict evolved, both sides increasingly believed that battlefield developments would strengthen their negotiating positions. Ukraine continued requesting military assistance from Western allies while expanding its domestic defense production. Russia meanwhile increased defense spending, adapted its industrial base, and repeatedly stated that its military objectives remained unchanged. Throughout 2025 and into 2026, intermittent diplomatic contacts continued. Such a proposal would not immediately end the war. Instead, it could potentially reduce missile and drone strikes that have repeatedly damaged civilian infrastructure and energy facilities on both sides. However, before those discussions could gain momentum, the Kremlin publicly signaled skepticism. Speaking to reporters, Dmitry Peskov said Moscow had received no concrete proposal and described reports surrounding the initiative as media speculation rather than formal diplomacy. The timing of those remarks was significant. They came only one day before President Trump and President Zelensky were scheduled to meet in Washington. That immediately raised an important question. Was Moscow simply waiting for an official proposal before responding? Or was the Kremlin deliberately lowering expectations before any negotiations could begin? Understanding that distinction is essential because public messaging has become an increasingly important part of modern diplomacy. Governments no longer communicate only through private negotiations. They also communicate through carefully crafted public statements aimed at influencing domestic audiences, foreign governments, financial markets, and military calculations. In many ways, today's war is fought not only with drones, missiles, and artillery, but also through narratives, expectations, and strategic messaging. Let's examine exactly what happened. Several days before the planned Washington meeting between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, Reuters reported that Ukrainian and U.S. officials had discussed presenting Russia with a proposal centered on an air ceasefire. Although few details became public, such an arrangement would theoretically focus on limiting attacks conducted through missiles, drones, and other aerial weapons rather than immediately freezing every ground operation. From a diplomatic perspective, limited ceasefires are often considered confidence-building measures. Negotiators sometimes believe that reducing one category of violence can create political space for broader negotiations later. Whether such an approach could work in Ukraine remains highly uncertain. Russia and Ukraine have accused each other of violating previous agreements, making trust extremely limited. Against that backdrop, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov addressed journalists in Moscow. His response was careful but unmistakably skeptical. He stated that reports regarding the proposal amounted only to media speculation and emphasized that Russia had not received specific information about any new peace initiative. That wording matters. Notice what Peskov did not say. He did not explicitly reject future negotiations. Nor did he announce that Russia would refuse to examine any proposal. Instead, Moscow portrayed itself as waiting for something official before making any decision. Diplomatically, that leaves room for flexibility while avoiding any appearance that the Kremlin is reacting emotionally to media reports. The Kremlin also declined to comment on separate statements made by President Zelensky regarding reports about possible North Korean troop deployments connected to Russia. Peskov dismissed those remarks by saying it was not Zelensky's place to discuss Russian military planning. Again, the language reflected a broader communication strategy. Rather than debating individual claims point by point, Russian officials attempted to project calm, discipline, and confidence. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues emphasizing that diplomacy cannot succeed unless Russia demonstrates genuine willingness to reduce military operations. At the same time, Kyiv has continued strengthening cooperation with Western partners on air defense, weapons production, and military assistance. Recent Reuters reporting also noted continued discussions between Ukrainian officials and American representatives regarding Patriot missile production and broader security cooperation. Those parallel military discussions illustrate an important reality. Diplomacy and military preparation are not mutually exclusive. In fact, throughout modern conflicts, governments frequently negotiate while simultaneously preparing for prolonged fighting. Each side hopes stronger military positioning will eventually improve its leverage at the negotiating table. That dynamic now defines much of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Even when leaders speak about peace, defense industries continue expanding production. Military alliances continue coordinating assistance. Drone technology continues evolving. And both governments continue trying to convince their own populations that time remains on their side. This is why every diplomatic headline deserves careful interpretation. One optimistic statement rarely changes battlefield realities overnight. Likewise, one skeptical Kremlin response does not necessarily eliminate future negotiations. Instead, it reflects the complicated balance between diplomacy, military strategy, domestic politics, and international pressure that now shapes every major decision surrounding the war. For the Kremlin, appearing cautious may reinforce the image that Russia cannot be pressured into accepting proposals before examining every detail. For Ukraine, maintaining active diplomatic engagement demonstrates continued commitment to pursuing peace while insisting that security guarantees remain essential. For Washington, any progress, however limited, would represent an opportunity to reduce the risk of further escalation. Yet as of today, no official agreement exists. No ceasefire has been announced. And according to the Kremlin itself, no concrete proposal has formally reached Moscow. That leaves the international community once again watching and waiting to see whether diplomacy can eventually catch up with a war that has already reshaped European security for more than 4 years. To understand why the Kremlin responded so cautiously, we need to look beyond the headlines and examine the strategic calculations shaping the war today. Diplomacy rarely exists in isolation. Every public statement, every proposal, and every carefully chosen phrase is influenced by conditions on the battlefield. When military operations continue at a high intensity, political leaders are often reluctant to make concessions that could be interpreted as weakness. That appears to be the situation facing both Russia and Ukraine. For Moscow, the central objective remains unchanged. Russian leaders continue to argue that any future settlement must address what they describe as the root causes of the conflict. Those include Ukraine's security orientation, the status of occupied territories, and Russia's broader confrontation with NATO. Kremlin officials have repeatedly stated that these issues cannot be separated from any meaningful peace agreement. From Ukraine's perspective, however, accepting Russian control over occupied territory without firm security guarantees would create the risk of future aggression. Ukrainian leaders continue to insist that sovereignty and territorial integrity remain the foundation of any lasting settlement. These positions remain fundamentally different. That gap explains why even limited proposals, such as an air ceasefire, face enormous political obstacles before they can become reality. Another important factor is military momentum. Neither side wants to enter negotiations from what it perceives as a position of weakness. Military commanders understand that battlefield developments influence diplomatic leverage. If one side gains territory, improves logistics, or strengthens air defenses, its political leadership may feel less pressure to compromise. Conversely, setbacks on the battlefield can increase incentives for diplomacy, but they can also encourage governments to double down in hopes of reversing those setbacks before negotiating. This strategic calculation has shaped the conflict since the earliest months of the invasion. According to assessments from the Institute for the Study of War, fighting has continued across multiple sectors of the front despite ongoing diplomatic contacts. Russian forces have maintained offensive operations in eastern Ukraine while Ukraine continues defensive operations, long-range drone strikes, and efforts to disrupt Russian military logistics. The persistence of these operations underscores that military objectives remain active even as diplomatic discussions continue. One of the defining characteristics of this war has been the increasing role of long-range weapons. Missiles and drones are no longer supporting elements of the conflict, they have become central to each side's strategy. Russia has repeatedly launched large-scale missile and drone attacks targeting Ukrainian infrastructure, including energy facilities and industrial sites. Ukraine, in turn, has expanded its own long-range drone capabilities, striking military airfields, fuel depots, logistics hubs, and defense-related facilities deep inside Russian territory. These attacks carry both military and political significance. Militarily, they can disrupt supply chains, damage equipment, and force the opponent to divert air defense resources. Politically, they demonstrate that neither side is immune from the consequences of the war, even far from the front lines. This is precisely why proposals for an air ceasefire attract international attention. If missile and drone attacks could be reduced, even temporarily, civilian casualties might decline, pressure on energy infrastructure could ease, and both governments might gain space for broader negotiations. However, implementing such an agreement would be extraordinarily difficult. Verification alone presents major challenges. How would each side confirm that attacks had stopped? How would accidental launches or disputed incidents be investigated? What mechanisms would determine responsibility if one side accused the other of violating the agreement? These are not theoretical questions. Previous ceasefire arrangements in Ukraine have often collapsed because each side accused the other of violations almost immediately after agreements took effect. Trust remains one of the scarcest resources in this conflict. Another strategic consideration is domestic politics. Governments involved in prolonged wars must constantly balance military decisions with public expectations. Russian officials cannot appear to accept proposals simply because international pressure increases. Likewise, Ukrainian leaders cannot be seen as compromising on issues that many citizens regard as existential. Every public statement therefore serves multiple audiences. When the Kremlin says it has received nothing tangible, it is speaking not only to foreign governments but also to the Russian public, military personnel, and political elites. The message reinforces the idea that Moscow will make decisions on its own terms rather than reacting to external pressure. Ukraine follows a similar communication strategy. Kyiv frequently emphasizes resilience, continued international partnerships, and the determination to defend national sovereignty. These messages strengthen domestic morale while reassuring foreign partners that military assistance continues to have strategic value. Another important reason diplomacy remains difficult is uncertainty. Neither Russia nor Ukraine can accurately predict how the conflict will evolve over the coming months. Military technology continues to change rapidly. Drone warfare has transformed battlefield operations. Electronic warfare systems are becoming increasingly sophisticated. Air defense networks continue evolving. Industrial production has become just as important as battlefield tactics. The country capable of producing more drones, missiles, ammunition, and replacement equipment over time gains a significant strategic advantage. That means military planners are constantly reassessing whether time favors their own side. If leaders believe future conditions will improve their position, they have less incentive to compromise today. International support also plays a decisive role. Ukraine continues receiving military, financial, and intelligence assistance from Western partners, although the pace and composition of that support remain subjects of ongoing political debate in several countries. Russia, meanwhile, has adapted its economy to wartime conditions while expanding defense production and seeking additional cooperation with partners outside the Western alliance system. These parallel efforts reduce immediate pressure on both sides to seek a rapid settlement. Instead, each government continues investing in the long-term sustainability of its war effort. This creates what many analysts describe as a war of endurance. Victory is no longer defined solely by capturing territory. It also depends on industrial capacity, economic resilience, technological innovation, international alliances, and political stability. That broader competition explains why even seemingly minor diplomatic developments generate such intense global attention. A single statement from the Kremlin, Washington, or Kiev can influence financial markets, energy prices, defense planning, and international diplomacy. But statements alone do not change realities on the ground. As of now, military operations continue. Diplomatic contacts remain open but fragile. Both Russia and Ukraine continue preparing for future negotiations while simultaneously preparing for future battles. That combination, talking about peace while preparing for war, has become one of the defining characteristics of this conflict. And until the strategic calculations of both sides begin to shift, meaningful progress toward a comprehensive settlement is likely to remain extraordinarily difficult. While military developments dominate the headlines, another battle is unfolding behind the scenes, one that may ultimately prove just as important as events on the front lines. It is a battle of economic resilience, industrial capacity, and public endurance. Wars of this scale are not sustained by soldiers alone. They depend on factories producing ammunition, transportation networks moving supplies, governments financing enormous military budgets, and civilians continuing to work despite years of uncertainty. For both Russia and Ukraine, maintaining that endurance has become one of the defining challenges of the conflict. Russia has significantly expanded its defense industrial base since the invasion began. According to assessments by the Institute for the Study of War and reporting from Reuters, Moscow has continued increasing military production while directing a substantial share of government spending toward defense and national security. Factories that once focused primarily on civilian production have increasingly shifted toward manufacturing equipment for the armed forces. This transition has allowed Russia to replenish some battlefield losses more quickly than many analysts initially expected. At the same time, however, wartime production comes with significant trade-offs. Resources directed toward military manufacturing are resources that cannot be invested elsewhere. Large defense budgets place pressure on public finances, infrastructure investment, healthcare, education, and long-term economic development. Russian authorities have repeatedly emphasized that the economy remains stable despite Western sanctions, pointing to continued industrial output, low official unemployment, and adjustments in trade patterns. Indeed, Russia has redirected a significant portion of its exports toward Asian markets while expanding commercial relationships with countries outside the Western sanctions framework. Oil and energy revenues remain a critical source of government income, although sanctions and price restrictions have complicated Russia's export strategy. Rather than collapsing under sanctions, the Russian economy has adapted in several important ways. New trade routes have emerged. Alternative financial mechanisms have expanded. Domestic industries have increased production in sectors considered strategically important. These adaptations illustrate that sanctions often reshape economies rather than producing immediate political change. Nevertheless, adaptation does not eliminate economic pressure. Inflation remains a concern. Labor shortages have become increasingly visible in certain industries as hundreds of thousands of workers entered military service or defense-related employment. Businesses in non-defense sectors have reported difficulties recruiting qualified employees. Some regional governments have introduced additional financial incentives to attract workers into critical industries. These trends reflect the broader reality that prolonged wars gradually transform labor markets. As more resources flow into military production, civilian sectors frequently experience shortages of workers, equipment, and investment. The result is an economy increasingly organized around sustaining the conflict. Ukraine faces an even more complex economic environment. Unlike Russia, Ukraine continues fighting while large portions of its territory have suffered direct damage from missile strikes, drone attacks, and years of active combat. Energy infrastructure has repeatedly been targeted. Transportation systems require constant repairs. Industrial facilities have experienced interruptions caused by security risks and electricity shortages. Despite these enormous challenges, Ukraine has managed to keep core government institutions functioning. Financial support from international partners has played an essential role. The European Union, the United States, the International Monetary Fund, and other allies have provided economic assistance that has helped Ukraine pay public sector salaries, maintain essential services, and stabilize government finances. Without that assistance, sustaining the country's wartime economy would be dramatically more difficult. At the same time, Ukraine has expanded domestic defense production wherever possible. Officials have repeatedly emphasized increasing local manufacturing of drones, electronic warfare systems, and other military equipment to reduce dependence on foreign supplies. This strategy serves both military and economic objectives. Producing equipment domestically strengthens national resilience while creating employment opportunities during wartime. Drone production, in particular, has become one of Ukraine's fastest-growing defense sectors. The rapid evolution of unmanned systems has fundamentally changed the nature of modern warfare. Relatively inexpensive drones can now perform reconnaissance, target artillery, attack armored vehicles, and strike logistics facilities far behind enemy lines. Because these systems cost far less than traditional aircraft, both Russia and Ukraine have invested heavily in expanding production. This technological competition has become one of the defining features of the war. But behind every drone is an industrial workforce. Engineers. Assembly lines. Supply chains. Software developers. Electronics manufacturers. Modern conflicts increasingly depend on economic organization as much as military planning. The social consequences of a prolonged war are equally significant. Millions of Ukrainians have experienced displacement since the invasion began. Many families remain separated as military personnel continue serving on the front while relatives live elsewhere inside Ukraine or abroad. Entire communities have adapted to daily air raid alerts, damaged infrastructure, and uncertainty about future attacks. These conditions create long-term psychological and demographic challenges that extend well beyond immediate military objectives. Russia has also experienced profound social changes. Although daily life in many regions continues relatively normally compared to active combat zones, the war has influenced employment patterns, government spending priorities, public messaging, and military recruitment. Defense-related industries have become major employers in several regions. Military service has become a significant economic opportunity for some citizens due to financial incentives offered by the government. Meanwhile, official media continue emphasizing national security, resilience, and the importance of supporting the country's military objectives. Information itself has become another battlefield. Both Russia and Ukraine devote significant resources to communicating with domestic audiences, countering opposing narratives, and maintaining public confidence. Governments understand that morale influences economic performance, recruitment, political stability, and ultimately military effectiveness. That is why official statements often focus not only on battlefield developments but also on resilience, production achievements, and national unity. International observers frequently describe this conflict as one of endurance rather than rapid maneuver. That description applies equally to economics. Success increasingly depends on which country can sustain production, finance military operations, replace damaged equipment, and maintain public support over an extended period. This explains why announcements about new factories, expanded defense contracts, or international financial assistance often receive nearly as much attention as reports from the battlefield. Economic resilience has become a strategic weapon. Neither Russia nor Ukraine appears close to exhausting its capacity to continue fighting. Both governments continue adapting. Both continue investing in military production. Both continue seeking stronger international partnerships. And both remain convinced that maintaining endurance today may improve their position in any future negotiations. This is precisely why recent diplomatic discussions have generated cautious optimism rather than immediate celebration. Even if political leaders agree to reopen negotiations, the underlying economic structure supporting the conflict remain firmly in place. Factories continue operating. Defense contracts continue expanding. Military budgets remain elevated. And the machinery of war continues turning on both sides. For now, the economic dimension of the conflict suggests that neither Moscow nor Kiev believes the struggle is nearing a decisive conclusion. Instead, both appear to be preparing for the possibility that this war, and the pressures it creates, could continue well into the future. As we've seen today, the Kremlin's rejection of reports about a new peace initiative was not simply a diplomatic soundbite. It reflected deeper strategic calculations that continue to shape every aspect of the Russia-Ukraine war. On one side, Ukraine and its allies continue searching for ways to reduce the violence and reopen meaningful negotiations. On the other, Russia insists that any serious proposal must address its long-standing security demands before formal talks can move forward. For now, the gap between those positions remains significant. The fighting continues. Military production continues. International diplomacy continues. And millions of people remain affected by decisions made far from the front lines. The coming weeks may reveal whether recent diplomatic contacts develop into something more substantial, or whether they become another chapter in a long series of unsuccessful attempts to end the war. One question now hangs over the international community. Is this merely another pause before the next escalation, or could it become the first step toward a genuine negotiation process? We'd like to hear your perspective. Do you believe diplomacy still has a realistic chance of ending this conflict, or do you think both sides remain too far apart for meaningful progress? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this analysis informative, consider subscribing to the channel for more fact-based coverage of the Russia-Ukraine war, global geopolitics, and the international developments shaping today's world. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.